Well, we are going to have a fascinating discussion between my two guests because they both hold, if you like, strident ways of putting their arguments across. I mean, it's fair to say that, JP, your website pulls no punches and the way you do your debating. I'd say the same is true very much in some ways of Ken. Your website and the tone of the book that you wrote on Jesus Never Existed is, in a sense, somewhat polemical. There are touches of, satire or humour, obviously, directed at Christians and their beliefs. But nonetheless, I think this is just a very interesting aspect of this whole thing, and I'm happy for you guys. I think it's a good matching here between yourself, Ken, and JP. So we'll look at with great interest at this debate. Did Jesus exist? Ken Humphreys says no. JP Holding says, of course he did, and I'll show you why. We're going to be looking at primarily whether there are contemporaneous witnesses to Jesus' existence, whether it's more than just the Bible said it, I believe it, whether we can look both within and without the Bible at the evidence for Jesus' existence, and we'll probably get onto some other aspects of this as well in the course of the programme. So do hope you can stay with me for this programme as we look at the evidence for the existence of Jesus with JP Holding and Ken Humphreys.
You're listening to Unbelievable on Premier Christian Radio.
Welcome back to the programme. Really interesting discussion topic today. Did Jesus exist? Well, you may say, surely that is perfectly obvious that he existed. Isn't the question more around things like whether he was raised from the dead? Well, there are people who are more sceptical than that, I can tell you. One of them is Ken Humphreys, who's the author of the website JesusNeverExisted.com. As he said, he, if you like, represents the somewhat more radical edge of historical analysis in terms of his actual denial of the very existence of the man Jesus. And we'll be finding out from him in due course why he doesn't believe there was an actual historical person called Jesus who did the things recorded in the Gospels and etc. So JP Holding, a Christian apologist, countering that and bringing his evidence for the existence of Jesus. Indeed, he brings evidence for the resurrection as well if you visit his website, tectonics.org. So before we come to JP, Ken, most people would say, what are you going on about? Jesus never existed. I mean, surely that's fairly indisputable, isn't it?
Well, let's take that point. Let's deal with this one up front and in an honest fashion. Most people in this world would agree that Jesus existed. I have no question with that. They will say, if asked, of course he existed. If you then ask them to say, well, explain how you know that, I think then you would discover they begin to and ah a little bit in trying to establish it. Because the fact of the matter is, the overwhelming majority of believers in the historical Jesus simply assume he existed. And not only do believers assume he existed, so do many scholars, and I've read many of their books. You can open them, and on page 1, in paragraph 1, they will make a declaration about the existence of Jesus. This is before they write anything investigating it. They will say Jesus was, Jesus did. Now, that is the problem that has to be stated up front. We cannot say Jesus existed simply because a lot of ill-informed people who have been socialised into a belief system simply go along with that notion and assume Jesus existed. I'm saying if there was such a character, let's look at what evidence we can find to substantiate that. And that's where the problems begin. And it's not just myself. For 200 years, scholars have gone down that path and thought, my gosh, there is no evidence here for the historical Jesus. And at that point, the wagons get circled.
OK, just maybe pinpoint what these things are then that these scholars would come across, things that suggest there really is no evidence for.
Well, the point is, if we are trying to establish a bona fide character as opposed to the probabilities of a character, then that is very different. Of course there were people called Jesus in first century Judea. and Galilee. There's no question about that. You only have to take the fact that if the population of the country was about 500,000 and Jesus probably was the name held by about 4% of them, then you've probably got 10,000 people called Jesus. Of course there were people called Jesus. I could sit here today and say there are people called Bob who live in Chicago. Not that I actually know any one of them that name. So this is simply the probabilistic likelihood of there being such a character. But if we are to believe the biblical story, we've got to go beyond that and find a particular Jesus that fits the bill.
I mean, and we'll let JP in on just a second, but just for those who are still scratching their head maybe and saying, but okay, well, what's wrong then with the gospel accounts? Why do you say that? Are you saying that they were made up? Are you saying that they were somehow sort of fables and came a long time later, that they were a composite of stories going around, none of which really had a basis in fact?
All of that, Justin, but I'll say it much more simply. Late and fake. That is what's wrong with the Gospels. They are late and fake. And that's why I make my first point. There is a lack of contemporaneous witnesses. That is, people alive at the purported time of Jesus who recorded the fact. Now, I know, and JP won't surprise me with anything here, the only answer they can make if called upon to answer that very specific question is yes, but. That is the problem.
Okay.
I'm sure there isn't anyone lurking there.
It's a kind of, you've spelled it out in fairly general terms there. I'm sure we'll get into the particular issues as we go on. So, JP, your response to this late and fake and the fact that there are a lack of contemporaneous witnesses.
All right, well, let's make sure we understand the terms of what we're talking about here. I made a comparison to the thesis that Shakespeare didn't write his plays and the Trade Center disaster was engineered. And his response was to the effect that this is different because we're talking about God interfering in human history. Well, God does not need to interfere in human history for there to be a historical founder of the Christian religion named Jesus who was crucified under Pilate. We're talking about two entirely separate issues here if we're going to get into did Jesus exist as a person versus did he do the things ascribed to him in the Gospels. I'm sticking here just for the purposes of debate with the issue, did this person simply exist, regardless of whether he did the miracles ascribed to him in the Gospels. Now, in terms of this issue of declarative statements being made by authorities, I've found in my research that they make these declarative statements because they've already done the background research, and they don't see a need to reiterate it each time they write a new book. And it has been stressed, again, as he noted, that many scholars agree with this view that Jesus existed. And he has alluded briefly to confessional interest. Now, I listened to the debate with Tony Costa, and he said, well, we would need to discuss why individual scholars who are not Christians continue to believe. In that case, one of my questions will be at some point, why does Bart Ehrman still believe in a historical Jesus if he is an agnostic? Now, finally, in terms of the main issue of contemporary witnesses, he says there's always a yes, but. Well, that doesn't matter if the but is a valid question. And in this case, I have a very valid point to make, which is that this idea that we have to have a contemporary witness is simply an invented rule. I'm not even going to bother with the Gospels here as evidence. I'm going to stick solely with the testimony of Cornelius Tacitus, which I feel by itself, even if the Gospels disappeared, even if Josephus disappeared, would be more than sufficient to establish a historical Jesus existed. Now, Tacitus reports many events that were not contemporary to him, and yet I have yet to see anyone simply say, well, simply because he is not a contemporary, that means that we can't take what he says as true. The reason that historians don't mind taking it otherwise is because they know that Tacitus did research, that he was a very reliable historian, that he knew his business.
Just give us an idea of when was Tacitus living and recording in relation to Jesus?
It's kind of difficult to establish exact dates of birth and death, of course, but most people would say he's somewhere mid-1st century is when he was born, say around the time of Nero or perhaps earlier, and that he died somewhere around 120, which would be the early 2nd century. Now, the life of Jesus, of course, would be somewhere around 4 BC to approximately maybe 33 AD, depending on what chronology you want to use. But obviously they were not contemporaries.